name is Iveta Silova, and I currently serve as a CIES president. Our society brings together more than 3,000 individual members, researchers, analysts, practitioners, students who represent universities, research institutes, government departments, non-governmental organizations, multilateral agencies, students across the globe. CIES was established as an academic association in 1956 and has attracted a diverse audience in working towards its mission to foster cross-cultural understanding and scholarship. As you all know, the COVID-19 pandemic has disrupted our lives and the operations of our society in major ways. For 2 years in a row now, we had to cancel our face-to-face annual meetings and rethink how we operate as a society. And despite all of these challenges, it's also a unique opportunity to reconfigure how we engage with each other and with our members in more sustainable and equitable ways. So, for example, we can now think about the questions how to stay connected and engage with colleagues who choose not to travel to the United States for political reasons, because of visa restrictions, because of lack of funding, or because they choose to travel less or not at all for environmental reasons. So I hope that we as a society can begin exploring these new ways of engaging with each other. And today is one of such opportunities, actually. CIES Awards are usually announced at our annual face-to-face conferences, but we have missed the opportunity to celebrate our award recipients last year because of this impromptu transition into the virtual space in the middle of the pandemic. Award ceremony actually was one of the events that fell through the cracks during that time. But to compensate for it and hopefully to improvise and improve, we decided to move the celebration online, extending an opportunity for more CIES members to join and engage with award recipients, and maybe even more importantly, allowing more time of this wonderful intellectual engagement. So instead of a couple of minutes at a large award ceremony face-to-face, today we will spend an hour with our award recipients celebrating their work and learning more about their work. But back to our event today. Today we are celebrating the recipients of the George Bereday Award for the best article published in Comparative Education Review. And I would like to ask Tom Luschei, who was the chair of the 2020 George Bereday Award Committee, to introduce the award recipients and tell us more about the award itself. So Tom, it's all yours.
Thank you, Iveta. Hello, everyone. It's great to see you all. I really miss you all, and I miss going to the annual CIES conference. So I was the Bereday Award Subcommittee Chair for 2019-2020, and my most important job in that role was to recruit an outstanding committee comprised of accomplished and dedicated comparative education scholars representing diverse geographic, disciplinary, and methodological expertise. So I want to name the committee, which consisted of Yilin Cheng, Marlene Lockheed, myself, Payal Shah, and Rolf Strabhar. The committee read all 23 articles published in 2019 in the Comparative Education Review. We narrowed that excellent group of articles down to 3 and awarded honorable mentions to 2 articles, and they were Tracy Brunette, Benjamin Piper, Rachel Jordan, Simon King, and Rehema Nabakwa, The Impact of Mother Tongue Reading Instruction in 12 Ugandan Languages and the Role of Language Complexity, Socioeconomic Factors, and Program Implementation, published in November 2019. And Sarah Dryden Peterson and Celia Reddick, What I Believe Can Rescue That Nation, Diaspora Working to Transform Education in Fragility and Conflict, published in May 2019. And the winners selected by the committee for the 2019-2020 Bereday Award are Amy Jo Dowd and Lesley Bartlett for their article, The Need for Speed, Interrogating the Dominance of Oral Reading Fluency in International Reading Efforts, which was published in May 2019. The Bereday Committee noted the article's clarity and strength of argument, rigorous conceptual framework, and the strong potential impact of research on education policy in the field of comparative education. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Amy Jo and Lesley. Congratulations again on being the 2019-2020 Bereday Award winners.
Hi, everyone. Thank you all so much. We want to thank the leadership of CIES for inviting us and for organizing this talk, and of course, thank the committee. that read all of the 2019 Comparative Education Review articles and for selecting ours to highlight. Of course, we want to thank all of you for taking the time to listen to this presentation and engage in this important conversation. Next slide. Today, we're going to give a talk based off 3 Comparative Education Review publications. First, the May 2019 article by Amy Jo Dowd and I called "The Need for Speed, Interrogating the Dominance of Oral Reading Fluency in International Reading Efforts." That article used data from Save the Children, and we want to thank all of the people working at Save who collected that data. In early 2020, Dr. Helen Abadzi and Dr. Tracy Santani published a critique of our article called "Why Fast and Effortless Reading is Indispensable for Comprehension." That's the second piece you may hear referenced today. And their critiques prompted Dr. Dowd and I to enter into discussions with a neuroscientist, Dr. Karen Froud, and a speech-language pathologist, Dr. Reem Khamis. And together, we wrote a response to the critique that's called "Measure Fluency, Vocabulary, and Comprehension in International Reading Efforts." You'll find both the critique and our response in Comparative Education Review, Volume 64, Number 2, and you'll hear us reference them today. Luckily, Dr. Karen Froud is here with us for the first half of today's presentation, and she will speak about the neuroscience referenced in that last piece. So today we're addressing this question: to what extent does assessment depend on the language and the material and social context in which a person is learning to read? CIE is a multidisciplinary field, and scholars situated in different disciplines will likely answer this question in different ways, as we'll hear today. Next slide. Brief overview of the talk. First, we'll discuss the historical background of EGRA, and Dr. Froud will discuss neuroscientific understandings of reading. Second, Dr. Dowd will give us an overview of the article. And finally, we'll discuss future directions in research and assessment, and we'll open up the conversation for discussion. So please feel free to use the chat function actively today to record any comments or questions you may have as we proceed. And then at the end of the talk, there will be plenty of time for engagement. Next slide. I should note, actually, there are a lot of folks on this mega Zoom who've been actively involved in early grade reading efforts for decades, and so we look forward to their comments as well. So in 2000, the report of the US National Reading Panel called "Teaching Children to Read" summarized the existing reading literature to identify 5 areas with sufficient data to make clear claims. And those areas were phonemic awareness, phonics, vocabulary, fluency, and comprehension. These have been identified as the 5 pillars of reading. The National Reading Panel privileged cognitive and psychological studies with experimental designs and based its recommendations primarily on research published in English and primarily conducted on students who were learning to read in English and spoke English. The report set aside second language learning because that topic was taken up by a separate panel. And this absence is notable given the degree to which this report has informed international reading assessment and intervention designs for multilingual populations. It's worth noting that the report's publication prompted debates and critiques from some scholars who argued that the National Reading Panel report and its summary obscured complex debates about reading research. Around that same time, as educational development actors shifted from expanding educational access into addressing educational quality, reading came to be seen as essential to enhancing quality. So in 2006, USAID contracted with Research Triangle Institute International staff to develop an instrument for assessing early grade reading. With input from an expert panel and informed by a review of existing reading assessments, RTI decided to take up and modify a set of tests called Dibbles, which stands for Dynamic Indicators of Basic Early Literacy Skills. Dibbles itself was developed at the University of Oregon as a continuous assessment tool to be used in classrooms and directly inform instruction. It was comprised of a series of short time tests, including rapid letter naming, letter sound naming, syllable reading, nonsense word reading, familiar word reading, reading a short passage aloud, and comprehension questions based on the segment of the passage that the student managed to read in the time allotted. And it's worth noting that Dibbles itself has been extensively critiqued by reading scholars, and that's something I'd love for us to talk more about. This next slide shows one sample task to look at phonemic awareness. And the next slide is a task for decoding. So RTI took tasks from Dibbles and translated them into different languages, field tested and further modified them, resulting in a set of tasks known widely as EGRA, or the early grade reading assessment. The extent to which EGRA was modified varies widely, and that's also worth discussing further. On the next slide, you're going to see a sample fluency and comprehension task, and I want to take a few minutes to talk about this. Our paper focuses particularly on the relationship between fluency and comprehension across languages. Fluency is defined as the combination of speed, accuracy, and prosody. But the EGRA measure reduces fluency to words correct per minute, ignoring prosody, which is central to meaning making. Furthermore, and this is relevant for our paper, which Dr. Dowd will present in a few minutes, the task made the measure of comprehension dependent on the timed measure of fluency. So as you can see here, students are allotted 1 minute to read the passage, and they are only asked comprehension questions that correspond to the sentences they read in that 1 minute. In other words, students must read quickly on this task in order to have a decent comprehension score. And this decision to make the comprehension score dependent upon a time fluency task has limited what we could learn about the relationship between fluency and comprehension across languages. Next slide, please. So EGRA in our field has become the tool to assess reading. It has been used widely in intervention efforts. And by 2016, it had been adapted and applied in 72 countries and almost 130 languages. It directly responded to the globally stated need for education quality. For example, USAID's 2011 to 2015 education strategy set a goal of improved reading skills for 100 million children in primary grades by 2015. And they invested hundreds of millions of dollars in this effort. But they needed a tool to measure those improved reading skills, and EGRA fit the bill. It's worth noting momentarily that so many of the development actors decided to emphasize assessment. Those funds could have been spent on improving instruction and aligning curriculum. And I think that's worth discussing as well. It's also worth pausing for a moment to ask if the core skills measured by EGRA are the only skills worth measuring, or if these skills are equally important across languages. For example, scholars have argued that learning to read in Bantu languages requires more attention to morphemes. Another factor that matters is orthographic depth, which depends on whether there's a one-to-one letter to phoneme relationship in the language, and that varies widely. A solid body of research demonstrates that children learning to read in different languages rely on those core skills differently. And finally, we need to consider that children are often learning to read in their second or third language without sufficient attention to their development of oral language in that target language. And this fact significantly complicates the learning process. So as I mentioned, in different locations, EGRA was adapted based on input from local experts, but that adaptation varied. Sometimes it was mere translation of tasks and norming of the text used for the fluency and comprehension tasks. Sometimes different tasks were introduced, added, or subtracted, depending on the country's sense of what was important to them. But the basic contours of the assessment tool, with its the constructs that it intends to measure, were not really open to negotiation. Furthermore, donors were really unwilling to consider bids or projects that did not incorporate EGRA. EGRA quickly became dominant in the field, and one might even say that it held a measurement monopoly. Implementing partners needed to include EGRA in their proposals in order to be competitive. And so this sense of agreement in the field coalesced fairly quickly, and there's certainly room for critique from experts who study reading in languages other than English or in multilingual settings. Let me turn quickly then to the debate over 60 words correct per minute, which is one of the core, which has been one of an area of focus in the field. So since the mid-2000s, there's been a debate over whether there's a universal target speed at which students can attain comprehension. The central idea behind this target is that working memory can only hold a certain number of items for a restricted period of time, and thus speed influences comprehension. Advocates of this view root their argument in neuroscience. Drawing on the notion of automaticity, many have accepted and promoted to partner ministries of education the idea that children must learn to read at a rate of 45 to 60 words correct per minute in order to achieve fluency and thus comprehension. Some international technical efforts promote words correct per minute benchmarks, and by using time-limited EGRA data to set them, they continue to privilege speed. Some even claim that correct words per minute is a reliable proxy for comprehension, which is one of the points we are contesting in this paper. This argument led international development organizations to concentrate on measuring words correct per minute, which includes rate and timed accuracy, but ignores prosody. And this decision to time the fluency measure and make comprehension scores dependent on that time fluency measure has significantly shaped findings in the field. This led us to wonder, what would untimed comprehension scores look like across languages? That's the question Dr. Dowd will address in the third part of our presentation. But before we turn to the data in the article, Dr. Karen Froud is going to address the question of how neuroscientists conceptualize the convergence of a range of cognitive skills in the act of reading. Dr. Froud?
Thank you so much, Lesley, and thank you, Amy, as well, for sharing your spotlight for a few minutes. I'm a linguist and a neuroscientist and also a speech-language pathologist, currently a professor of neuroscience and education at Columbia University Teachers College. I've been working with Amy and Lesley for a while, and I'm so grateful to be here just for a few minutes to try and summarize the Neurocognitive Foundations that are so crucial to this work. So first of all, one thing we know is that we are not born with neural circuitry dedicated to this task of reading, and becoming a reader involves building the necessary integration between cognitive skills and associated circuits. And at least these four pretty complex domains need to interact with one another in order to develop this convergence that supports literacy. So reading depends on multiple interactions between multiple brain circuits, each of which is subject to individual experiences and developmental trajectories, and those vary within and between individuals. The specialization of this circuitry emerges with instruction and experience, and that specialization is what yields the thing we refer to as automaticity. That refers not to how quickly something gets processed, but the extent to which there is specialization of the responses to print in these interacting brain networks. And that's why automaticity has been tied to this brain region you might have heard of, the visual word form area, the VWFA. That's a region that emerges as crucial to reading as a result of this interaction and specialization. Next slide, please. So this slide is a warning. This is what happens when you try to condense decades of neuroscientific research into a few minutes. Don't do it. Don't try this at home. And the aim here is not to describe each of these models in full, but just to point out some commonalities and complexities across the different domains that each constitute a huge field of study. So over here on the top left is a currently dominant conceptualization of the neural interactions required for some aspects of speech and language processing, including dorsal sensory pathways that permit integration between sensory inputs and articulation, so clearly crucial for reading, and then ventral pathways that provide parallel access to lexical representations. Those are a special instance of memory and therefore engage medial temporal lobe circuits. And then interactions between those systems are reciprocal and include phonological processing networks in temporal cortex. And the whole system itself is continuously interacting with a widely distributed conceptual network that permits integration of different aspects of meaning and knowledge. Then underneath that, also on the left, is just one model of the circuitry associated with visual attention. So bottom-up attention relies on saliency maps that are sensitive to strong sensory inputs, and those are in parietal cortex. But for our purposes, top-down shifts of attention originate in the frontal cortex. Those are excitatory connections that selectively enhance the level of stimulus representation for a specific task at hand, such as reading. Suppressing unattended stimuli, also important, but that occurs via local lateral inhibitory interactions. And so again, what we see for attention is a highly complex interactive system with reciprocal connections with other cortical and subcortical regions, as well as local circuitry that modulates the responses within the network. So that kind of complexity is a theme for each of these systems. So over here on the right, again at the top, is one representation of neuroanatomical circuitry involved in episodic memory, of course, very salient again for this complex cognitive task. So the hippocampus kind of sits on top of a cortical hierarchy and encodes information from all over the brain, binding it together into what we call an episodic memory trace. But like the pathways for language and visual attention, what we're seeing here is intense local and long distance connectivity and reciprocity. So there are connections within this region and between this region and others. For example, the amygdala is pointed out here, and that supports emotional responses associated with memories. And then the last little picture down at the bottom in the center here is supposed to represent executive function networks. No surprise that those are also complex and include both local and long distance reciprocal connections, both within and between the frontal cortex and other regions. So this little overview actually includes 5 interacting executive function networks, each of which contains feedback and feed-forward loops. And of course, there's a role for each of those in reading because it's a hugely complex cognitive endeavor. But I'll just draw specific attention to the executive function network in black here. It's needed for cognitive flexibility, such as that's required when you translate between visual stimuli and spoken words. So this actually includes a response loop mediated via basal ganglia so that actions and responses get modulated before motor activation. So think reading aloud. When we ask a child to read words to us, among other things, they also have to engage that loop of executive function. So what we can see just from this very brief overview is that reading is a distributed and multimodal, attentionally controlled learning circuit, and through exposure and experience that comes to shape print expertise. And this, of course, underpins the fact that orthographic learning is much, much more than learning visual patterns, for example. It's an intensely relational process, and it's supported by attention, executive function, memory networks, as well as language. Next slide, please. So what happens when you try and bring all of that circuitry together? In this simplified model, you can see that a written word in the brain starts as a visual object encoded at the back of the brain in generic visual cortex. But that specialization we've been alluding to that allows reading to become automatic and therefore not reliant on cognitive load or visual complexity or any of those extraneous variables, that relies on this other area a little bit anterior. That's the visual word form area, the VWFA. It's in the fusiform gyrus. And this is the region that becomes attuned to the shapes of letters and strings of letters that constitute words in any given orthographic system. Now, many brain imaging studies have shown us that the major response from the VWFA when it recognizes a word happens 170 milliseconds after the visual percept is first identified in primary visual cortex. So we know that word processing is much, much faster and much further upstream than the actual pronunciation of those words. And information from the VWFA is then transmitted to other regions involved in pronunciation, articulation, and other kinds of representation. The areas in green here are activated by spoken language. And there's a lot of research currently showing that the interactions between spoken language and visual processing are actually very important predictors for future reading success. We see those areas activated even in babies a few months old. But what's special about reading is this area in red, the VWFA, which is an interface between the visual system and then existing systems for language, attention, memory, and so on. So in other words, learning to read consists of creating a bridge between vision and language. It's the visual representation of words and text corresponding to sounds and meanings in language. And if and when automaticity is achieved, the convergence between those systems is subserved by the VWFA. Next slide, please. Just to sum up, this whirlwind tour of the neurocognitive perspective on reading demonstrates, first of all, there is no single pathway to skilled reading. Each individual must build the functional neurocircuitry for processing written symbols and then integrate that circuitry with language processing and the other networks that are important for that. The development of automaticity in the brain takes time and it takes exposure. So we know that getting to automaticity is not dependent on visual characteristics, not on complexity, not on how many words are read each minute, which in any case varies widely depending on specific properties of a language and an orthography. Rather, it depends on the convergence of activation between circuits associated with processing print and processing spoken language. And this process is affected by many factors, some of which are listed here, some are discussed in more detail in the paper, but there will always be extraneous and highly variable and heterogeneous factors that affect the consistency of input and experience. And also, I just want to leave with a reminder that automaticity is indexed much earlier in the process of reading than can accurately be reflected by metrics like reading speed. So this is very broadly the neurocognitive context for Amy and Lesley's work and our work together. And here's Amy to fill us in on where all of this is headed with respect to reading assessment.
I need to do the classic unmute before you all remind me I'm on mute. So thank you so much. So I'm going to go over the article very briefly so that we can get into some discussion because I'm super excited about that. But as Karen said, we're sort of building from the notion that speed is just a part of a much more complex picture that involves language, context, sound, meaning, exposure. And so we looked at the speed and untimed accuracy in reading comprehension in 11 data sets. Oops. I seem to have lost there, in 11 sites across Save the Children literacy implementation areas where 6,250 students were assessed. We used an untimed reading passage, and in 3 of the sites, more than half of the students speak a second language at home, but in 2 additional ones are multilingual, but not with such large multilingual populations. So using these data, we asked how fast do children who read with comprehension read? So in this setting, we're taking just the children who read with comprehension as a subgroup of these larger samples. And what we found, the answer was the range was 30 to 96 correct words per minute. We then asked, does this differ if they do not speak the language of instruction at home for the samples in which this was a feature? And we found that yes, it did, and significantly so. We asked whether fast readers, fast is in parentheses, in quotes there, because there were some countries where the average was very, very high in the 80s and 90s. We asked if they were predicted to read with comprehension. The answer was actually no. We asked whether the measure of speed, untimed accuracy, and reading comprehension were correlated, and found that untimed accuracy and speed were highly correlated at 0.41, or medium-sized correlation of 0.41, and that they were both correlated with reading comprehension at just 0.29, 0.25 respectively. And finally, we asked how accurately do children who read with comprehension read? And in this case, the answer was 94 to 99% across the 11 sites. So having looked into whether the speed and accuracy at which students achieve comprehension varies by language, we really have sort of 2 main conclusions, and I want to talk a little bit about their implications. So first, we think that the speed, the correct words per minute cannot be delimited with the precision required of a global metric, that language-specific ranges are necessary, and maybe even targets need to be differentiated for pupils who are learning a second or even a third language. We also think that this all requires localized inquiry and dialogue. We see that also that untimed accuracy offers an identifiable threshold across languages at which children read with comprehension, but we don't think that this correlates so strongly with comprehension that we're convinced that it can serve as a proxy for comprehension. The implications of the variation of speed and comprehension across the languages that we find are such that we think that unlike first language learners in second language, because second language learners read more slowly, this makes AGRA's time limit a barrier to understanding the child's competency. We also think that this is significant in grade 2. The fact that it's significant at grade 2 makes its use as a system or population diagnostic, or even for reporting on SDG 4.1.1a, a source of data that is problematic. because using fluency to represent comprehension in this way could make stakeholders think that things are better or worse than they are, as our findings suggested. Directions for future research. I think, as Lesley mentioned, a lot of people on this call have already taken things in many of these directions. So I'm going to name them, and I hope we can discuss all the progress that people have made since this article was published, because it's already been a couple of years, which implies it's been a couple of years since it was submitted. First and foremost, just quite obvious, devise and test better reading comprehension measures. I think innovating and testing strategies to build students' oral comprehension is implied by the review that Karen gave us. And maybe even reintroducing the oral comprehension into the mix, because it was in the sort of 2009s, 2010s, was in some early AGRA testing. I think we need to be testing language sensitive benchmarks as they arise in more and more countries to the sensitivity of timing in multilingual populations. Investigating whether and how fluency benchmarks are affecting curriculum and pedagogy. And then finally, devising and testing measures of vocabulary alongside the component skills that we have, as well as reading comprehension, to really understand the relationship among these factors in different languages. 3 quick future directions, and then I'll turn it back over to Tom. We're seeing a lot of reading is learning. And I think this is, of course, because the data is available, but I do feel that as we as an industry and a group involved across the globe looking at learning, whether we're intervening or assessing, we should be asking if a focus on reading is excluding other learning or crowding out or thinking about strategies for action. In a similar way, many COVID analyses of learning loss are looking at reading loss, and we need to pursue holism. Asking where we can add some other measures, socio-emotional learning, creativity, executive function, and others, to deepen our understanding of how these elements interact in our world and with the world of reading development, and how we can use that knowledge to better support learning. And finally, we feel that future assessment development should incorporate local perspectives and models of reading or other skills, acknowledge positionality, and build assessment systems with and for ministries, teachers, and students. And I'll stop there, and I believe I'll turn it back over to Tom to start us off.
Great, thank you so much for your excellent presentation. I learned even more than I did the first time I read your article. So we have a lot of participants. We have about 25 minutes. So it's difficult to see everyone on the same screen. So if you do have questions or comments, I encourage you to share them in the chat. But before we open it up, we have invited Dr. Helen Abadzi to respond to the presentation. And I am looking through these screens to see if Helen is here. Due to our
yes, I am here. Yes, hello, and I'm here, and thank you very much.
And I just wanted to say that due to our time limits, we will need to limit the response to 5 minutes.
Of course.
Thank you.
To begin with, this is an extremely good opportunity to discuss all of these issues that, as Amy Jo has said over the years, have become kind of the monopoly of, RTI and EGRA. Permit me to say, I greatly admired the work and have used very often the schematic to where you show words per minute increasing because it shows something that I wish Karen Freud would address more. Perceptual learning, the low-level areas of visual perception and how those circuits come up with configuring shapes in the beginning small and then larger ones, which are done through practice. And also, we need to understand much better where and at which stages working memory intervene. And again, I would like Dr. Freud to rethink about this issue because neuroscientists don't see working memory. It's not a unitary, circuit in the brain. But the findings actually strengthen this issue. The students need to configure shapes in front of them. When the shapes are small, such as short words in the Latin script in Vietnamese, these get configured faster. When the shapes are longer, such as the more complex, visually complex shapes of Urdu, of Hindi, and also of the Bantu languages that connect 4 or 5 words in one, it takes longer. What Amy, Jo, and Lesley emphasized, showed very obviously, is words thus far have been counted as stuff between spaces. No, words are within many of these spaces. So there is the question how to count them. We need that because we need to assess the perceptual learning that happens. In the early stages, this is critical, unfortunately, because it goes right into whatever goes into working memory. We need to understand the neuroscience of it much more, but students cannot make sense. And by the way, for prosody to happen, the visual word form area must be activated in order to enable parallel processing. The perceptual learning research has not been taught in colleges of education. It's even obscure among psychologists. Dennis Pelli's lab at New York University, and of course, many Italians like Simone Gori and Francoetti have discussed these things. But it becomes crucial to understand that in the beginning, we need to both measure what students are able to do and not. If you want to do untimed testing, don't just give them 60 words, give them 2 pages. Because after 60 words are done, much more text comes in real life. Certainly, a 60-word text, you can read with 5 words per minute fluency and accuracy. You read it again and again. The meaning, eventually, enough of it stays in working memory. But this is highly insufficient. So unfortunately, we are stuck with words per minute because we lose so many students at the early stages. Those stages where perceptual memory matters so much more than the more expansive view of reading past automaticity where you can do prosody. We're stuck with that. And we're stuck with being able to measure comprehension in a way that is applicable, that is standardized. If we give you 60 words, you could give 30, you could give 90. How much are you going to hold into working memory, given that it takes you time to shape all of these things in your mind of perceptual learning? This is why the standardization matters. But we want to go, sure, we can go beyond the 60 word, the concept of words per minute by doing 2 or 3 things. And for the past decades, I have suggested this to RTI. There are 4 or 5 ways of measuring. Bantu word languages need to be broken up, for example, and actually the blanks would be helping students. We do factors like 1.3 Zulu words are equal to one English word. There's other ways. And of course, event-related potentials nowadays, direct, shall I say, neuroimaging enables us to see visual word form activation. In fact, and Amy, Jo, you may want to keep track of this. Next summer, my co-author, Tracy Santani, and I will be in the Emirates measuring words per minute, comprehension, and event-related potentials to see what do we get. Therefore, unfortunately, we are stuck with words per minute. For the early low stages, they're necessary. They are necessary also for higher ones, but we don't get into that. They need to get better clarified. Comprehension somehow needs to be standardized. That is content in working memory. And by the way, children, working memory varies. But we're stuck with saying, what sense can you make out of it? I would very much welcome how to improve this. I would welcome very much for RTI to rethink. By now, we understand that all of this is comparable. The brains are very comparable. The pathways are very comparable. And to go to the next stage, because we have the Sustainable Development Goals. We need to have some targets. We don't want countries to say, well, the child really reads 10 words per minute, but we think understands more if they read the passage 5 times. All of this needs to be rethought. I am very available to discuss these things at greater length. And I really thank Amy, Jo, and Lesley for putting out this article, particularly that terrific table which shows difference in words per minute by language. And I thank you very much for your time.
Great, thank you, Helen. Would the authors like to respond?
May I, since I was invoked a couple of times in Dr. Abadzi's comments? I mean, I am more than happy to talk at length about circuitry associated with working memory and other executive functions. And, you know, there's every aspect of language processing. There has been many decades of research looking at how this is instantiated in the brain. We don't understand all of the pathways yet. There's a lot more work still to do, but you can be certain that perceptual learning, working memory, these kinds of issues are gradually becoming more transparent with respect to reading. What I want to point out, though, is that it's important to understand something like reading is something so cognitively complex, and most of the cognitive complexity happens behind the scenes. You can't observe it by looking at behaviors. When you ask people to read lists of words at a certain speed, you're losing any kind of indexing of the processes that go into that. And so what you get is some kind of blunt measure that tells you either, yes, they can do it this fast, or no, they can't do it that fast. None of that tells you what might actually be happening in the brain that might or might not be supporting that process. I also really want to talk about the comments about things like 1.3 Zulu words equals 1 English word, and things about the visual complexity of specific orthographies and so on. I think that this is rather problematic for moving forward with this kind of research, because we know that those orthographic differences do change the ways that people handle that converging expertise in the brain systems. But it's not about whether one language is written in a more complex way than another. It's about the exposure and the experience that people have. And if you try to use English as some sort of, you know, this is how a language should look, with gaps between words and this many syllables per word, then actually we would really end up kind of doing a disservice to people who are acquiring other languages and acquiring literacy in those systems. What we view as complexity in the written language systems isn't really complexity, it's just difference. And the visual word form area is able to integrate and specialize with those other systems that I was talking about earlier to handle whatever the orthography actually looks like. We just know that the way that it does that, the exposure that happens, maybe can take a different time course, maybe can look slightly different. So it's not the case that, you know, inserting spaces into Bantu words would somehow make to process. No, because if you had the experience and the exposure to Bantu orthography, then that is what becomes automated. That's actually what becomes automatized. Not, you know, putting spaces into words that don't belong there is actually adding a kind of complexity to the text and making it more difficult for people to attain automaticity.
We can take this offline. I don't want to confuse everybody. I'm very happy to discuss further. And I think we're all on the right path of trying to figure this out right. And thank you very much, Karen.
Thank you. It looks like we've got quite a few questions in the chat. I think the first one is from Fran Vavris.
Yeah, so I don't know if you want me to restate the question or not, but I had two questions about really trying to understand the reasons for this narrow focus on speed. And I appreciated Dr. Abazi's comments, but I'm still a bit confused about that, especially since so many children assessed by EGRA are multilingual learners. And the second is maybe more a political question about why USAID has spent so much money on assessment rather than on teacher professional development to improve the teaching of literacy, which would get at the fundamental problem here.
So I think those are things we need to consider, and I think there are folks who have worked with USAID on the call who might want to say something about this. My sense is that people felt it was necessary to have assessments in order to then be able to negotiate or lobby governments to make some changes to the curriculum and to perhaps teacher education, teacher preparation. But I myself have questions about what does it mean to be testing students on segmenting sounds before we've taught students to segment sounds or to read nonsense words. I find that problematic. So.
I think I also would like to add to Leslie's comments that there seems as well to be a drive, even in the way that Helen is framing her constructive responses, the drive to a single measure or being efficient and effective, which I get, but I also think it has led to hampering a broader view of this multifaceted process we call learning to read. I don't know if there are other participants who want to weigh in on this topic. Since many of you aren't on camera, we can't see you. Like, you want to turn on your cameras and wave to weigh in on these 2 points. Otherwise, we can go to the next.
Tom,
May I ask?
May I weigh in there?
Go for it, Manuel.
Manuel, please.
Thank
And
you,
then we've got
Iveta.
a question from Elliot Friedlander, which I will read.
Yes, on the point of speed, I think I'm working on repetition now. I've done some work on some of these issues with MHO regarding reading, and it's been a pleasure, of course. But I'm doing some work on repetition, grade repetition now, and I'm wondering if this obsession with efficiency that we see in the education system has roots not only in human capital theory, which is part of what I'm looking at, but also even going further back on scientific management, the idea of industrial processes being fast, being productive, being efficient. And it is something that I know that it's not a specific focus on reading. It's more about what is the ideology that is driving our obsession with speed, with going through schools quickly, with reading quickly and getting the gist, and not encouraging multiple or layered interpretations of a text, but rather getting what I need from the text and moving on. And from, as a sociologist or someone whose original background is in sociology, I wonder whether this is something that we can also explore in the future.
As I noted, Elliot has a question, but I wanted to let Ben Piper come in here because he's raised an important issue in the chat. And then after Ben speaks, Ben, assuming you want to speak, and then I will read Elliot's question.
Yeah, and congratulations to Amy, Joe, and Lesley. This is really important work, and excited to be in a virtual session like this in lieu of face-to-face. I guess my comment is that a lot of the discussion we've had so far, and even some of the questions, I think are really responding to versions of EGRA that were used 10 years ago. And I think that there's been work that I've done and others have done that have tried to expand the types and methods of comprehension measures, the relationship between those comprehension measures and the fluency measures, expanding quite rapidly the variety of ways to look at vocabulary, other issues that we agree are really important. So I think that Amy, Joe, and Lesley and others on the call, I agree, and I bet most of the people agree that kind of the initial narrow focus and the kind of too close relationship between comprehension and fluency, I don't agree with now, and I think that's the good thing about research. We can improve on things we've done in the past. So, and maybe to some of the last points that Amy Jo made in her recommendations on kind of focusing more on instructional improvement, then in fact, I think that's far more important than deciding kind of which are the final versions of the elements of EGRA that should be included to be considered EGRA, because in my experience, I've seen 14 different types of tools that try and do something like what you've done. Now, that said, it's hard to do. And some of the work that we've done, particularly specifically in Kenya, shows that some of the relationships between listening and, silent and oral comprehension and timed and untimed, the differences, at least in Kenya, weren't as wide as maybe we assumed they were. But I think these issues are important, but I really do think even in the rest of the conversation, I'd love for us to focus on, the status of the field when it comes to these issues now, which is quite significantly broader with respect to the types of comprehension measures and relationships between fluency and the various skills than they were in the initial stages of this work and this tool. Thanks, everybody, and thanks to Amy, Jo, and Lesley for a really important contribution.
Thank you, Ben. Great to hear your voice. All right, let's go to Elliot's question, Elliot Friedlander. An issue I wonder about: the working memory literature with which I am familiar measures working memory using strings of digits or letters that do not contain any meaning. But in our work, we do not ask children to read meaningless text, quite the opposite. How does this change our understanding of working memory as it relates to reading comprehension?
Is it possible to answer this question? Okay, because as working memory, understanding becomes more complicated. And by the way, it's multimodal, it doesn't sit in one place. We understand that each item in there, and by the way, we use 7 items in 12 seconds. These are generalities from the 50s, but they work in some way. Becomes, as you automatize small chunks into bigger chunks, one chunk becomes one item. So multiple items that are, it's like multiple trains running into a station. So on one hand, 5 and 7 digits and these simplistic measures give you a sense. On the other hand, when you're highly educated, you know a lot, and particularly you have automatized this perceptual learning patterns, then all of these, they become like much longer trains that run into the station that holds like, 7 items. It does matter a great deal. All of you understand, if any one of you knows another script, a language, and you know Arabic and you read Arabic as a second language, or Hindi or something else, try and see how difficult it becomes to comprehend a single sentence when you're reading it haltingly. By the end of the sentence, you forget the beginning. The children are no exceptions. We need to deal with this upfront obstacle, and we need to figure out ways to query this also neuroscientifically, not just from the cognitive psychology memory perspective. But this is why it becomes a big problem. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Now the chat has gotten so large that I'm having trouble keeping track of which is the next question. Yes, please go ahead.
Can I just add, and I think Karen would want to add if she were here, is that I think you need to take all of that Helen just said and put it into the systems that Karen showed us, and they have to interact with the speech, and they have to interact with meaning, that there's more pieces of the puzzle than that. So it's not just how many can you hold, it's how many are interacting effectively. And I think this is where we come to a space in which we see reading as much more multifaceted as just the speed only piece.
When you're an advanced reader, of course.
All right, let's move to Celine Lee's question. Are the results of your research specific to early grade reading, or does it also extend to reading assessments for older students such as PISA?
So in an original view of this session, before we invited Karen and Helen to sort of expand our notions into the response, we actually had this as one of our questions for discussion. I think it is really important to consider many of the aspects of not just so much learning to read, but where the assessments come from and what they value. And the fact that these are sort of driven by a global set of chosen items. To what extent are they adapted? To what extent is adaptation possible or allowable in these sort of international large-scale assessment systems? Super important. And I think those are the most important aspects of this particular debate that go up into sort of some of the upper grades and the later grades. I don't know, as Helen's saying, once you're a good reader, many of these sort of issues around processing and subcomponents fall away. They're what they call constrained skills. But that's I think is my take, is sort of to what extent are these adapted and fitting into both the language and the context and making meaning within those systems.
So it unfortunately looks like we're not going to get to all the questions. So I just want to ask Amy, Jo, and Lesley if there are any comments in the chat that you really want to address before our time is up. It looks like we only have about 2 more minutes.
I think that requires faster reading than I'm capable of.
You need more speed.
I need more speed.
Yeah, you need to go from 300 to 400. Permit me one thing. Unfortunately, EGRA calcified in many respects in those early English dyslexia instruments. Where, nonsense words are not necessary for anything, even and particularly not for the transparent orthographies of the world. We deal with not English, French, Portuguese, which is what Diagram do best. We deal with Urdu, we deal with Hindi, we deal with Divehi. These are all transparent orthographies. You need 2 subtests. If you want to get the beginning of the children, how many words, letters correct per minute, letter sounds. How much connected text do you read? What sense do you make out of it? The rest of it doesn't matter, but it's become hugely complicated. And I'm afraid, again, too much assessment instruction and too little instruction. And I see Penelope's commentary here, but we need to teach. And by now we know to teach. I humbly request another webinar on this, because there is much to discuss with respect to perceptual learning, perceptual enhancement, so that the students can move fastest into the domains that Amy Jo and everyone else would like to carry them to. And thanks again.
All right, Amy Jo and Lesley, the last word goes to you. Any concluding remarks you'd like to make?
I just want to be a little bit provocative in conclusion and address Penelope's comment and Joel's comments. I do think we need to think about assessments as performative. They are actors. They are out there, they take on a life of their own. They're used to do all kinds of different things. And pronouncements, like we need a certain level of words correct per minute in order to be able to read, also take on a life of their own. They're actors. And so I'm really interested in the politics of assessment. I'm interested in the will to assess and why, as a field, we focus on one thing or another at different times. So to me, there's a whole line of research that would be interesting to think about and discuss in that regard. There are questions about making a better assessment, and then there are bigger questions about the politics of assessment that I'd love for us to discuss.
I'm actually going to throw in the mother of all controversial questions is, should we assess? And that's going to be the last word, because I think we're at time.
She said it, not me.
Okay. All right, I don't know, Iveta, if you have any concluding remarks or announcements from CIES?
Just wanted to thank everybody for joining us today, and a huge congratulations to award recipients, and thanks everybody for participating. Also, please don't forget to vote. Our CIES bylaws requires that at least 20% of membership participate in elections, and we are just a few votes away from that number. So if you have not voted, please vote and ask your colleagues to vote. All right. But more importantly, congratulations to everyone. And we'll see you in a few weeks at the more online events for the CIES.
Thank you all so much for the opportunity. This is great fun. Take care, everyone.
Congratulations again.
Congratulations.